Most films have been directed by men. Most of the recognized so-called movie classics were directed by men. For 13 decades, and on all 6 filmmaking continents, thousands of women have been directing films too. Some of the best films. What movies did they make? What techniques did they use? What can we learn about cinema from them?
Form and content, violence and tenderness, love and loss.
We have seen the world.
Hundreds of great examples of cinema, 14 hours on the road.
The films we looked at have far more female protagonists.
Far more women at the centre of the movies. Hooray for that.
Women make movies, great movies. They've done so since the birth of cinema.
They've helped define the anarchic, androgynous rectangle.
The movie screen.
There are surprises in what follows. Let's start at the beginning.
Hello and welcome to this BFI at Home event. My name is Isabel Stevens. I work at the BFI's film magazine, Sight and Sound, and tonight I'm joined by filmmaker and critic Mark Cousins. We will be discussing his latest film, Women Make Film, a new road movie through cinema. This is a 14-hour journey through films from 1900 to present day, all by female filmmakers from all over the world. The focus here is on the art of cinema rather than on the filmmakers' biographies. And this is an art, the film suggests, that we have been missing out on because we've been too enthralled to a male-dominated version of film history. Women Make Film is a phenomenal experience of discovery. It's addictive and eye-opening, and best of all, it makes you want to go out and watch all of the films we see clips from. So, hello, Mark.
Hi, Isabel. Thanks for that.
Thanks for joining us. So, first of all, I guess I was interested in 2015, you wrote for Sight and Sound in a column that we have to assume women directors are out there. When was it you first realised that kind of your view of film history was somewhat blinkered by kind of received wisdom about the canon, and also that secondly that you realised that female filmmakers were out there? It's just that we didn't know about them.
Yeah, it was in the late 90s that I started to really realise this kind of stuff. I did a series of films about the great moments in documentary history, and there was only one woman in it. And I annoyed myself. Only afterwards did I realise there was only one woman in it. And I started to look in documentary, and of course there were loads of female directors. And my background's science, and in science you're treated to assume that it's out there. I've got Marie Curie tattooed on my arm. Marie Curie assumed that radium was out there. You just have to keep looking. And so that's been my approach in my work as a filmmaker. Keep looking, it must be out there. And I think lots of people assume that there are no great Venezuelan female filmmakers. There are no great Spanish female filmmakers of the 50s. There are.
And this film was 5 years in the making. So you started thinking and deciding to make it in 2015. What was it that sort of made you decide to make this film now? And did the rise of feminism in the last 7 or so years play a role in that?
It was... it's sort of been a lot longer than that in a way. You build up a list in your head, Isabel, of the great films you've seen directed by women. And so I remember, for example, seeing Marion Hansel's films 10 years ago, for example, and you build and build a sort of excitement and a fury. So maybe, we started editing about 5 years ago. I was influenced by things like Simone de Beauvoir and the feminist movement in film in the 70s, and Laura Mulvey and the great Carrie Beecham, the great film historian. So there was nothing too recent that was an influence. By that stage, we were sitting here where I'm talking to you now in the edit suite, and we were dug in the tunnel of editing.
Did the sort of rise of feminism recently, did it make it easier to make this film? Were funders more receptive? I'm interested, I guess, in the comparison that you had, say, to making a story of film, which was your sort of big history of cinema that you made over 10 years ago now. Was this film easier to make than that? Was it harder to track down the films? Because that film had a similar, very expansive focus, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is no, a most definite no. This was harder. We got not a single penny of funding from any institute or any TV company at all. So we made it off our own back. The rise of feminism the rise of the more recent feminism that you're talking about came much too late for us, intellectually or in terms of production funding, you know. So we went it alone, and we worked for years on our own without any funding. But there's a liberty in that, you know. There's a kind of intellectual freedom and creative freedom. Looking back, I think people thought that too much of this is unfamiliar. We haven't heard of BINKA ZHELYAZKOVA. We haven't heard of Malvina Ursianu. A lot of people still haven't heard of these great filmmakers. And so it's hard to get funding for stuff that people haven't heard of. And even some people in the activist movement and even some of the feminists that I met over the years they just assumed this stuff was not there. You know, I was meeting lots of people, and I absolutely want the revolution to happen, and I'm part of the revolution, hopefully, and change in film culture. But some of the people I was meeting, they weren't interested in the old stuff. They'd never heard of Edith CARLMAR, and I thought, why not?
And why hadn't they heard of them? Is it just because you think the people aren't curious enough, or sort of how does this kind of myopia arise?
You know, before the internet, it was really understandable that we didn't hear about these people, because you had to go to the BFI library or you had to go to a specialist film research facility to hear about these great figures. Since the internet, the information, Isabel, is all sitting there. And even if it's written in a language you don't understand, you just use translate and you translate it. So you need to have there's an old-fashioned phrase, an inquiring mind, you know, and I think you need to have that. And the people who have that keep looking for stuff and keep assuming that it's there, you know. So it used to be we could blame other people, we could blame film culture, we could blame people like me, middle-aged white guys, for being the gatekeepers and the storytellers of film history. But now we are freer than that, and there's a world out there of people who want to share their passion for this stuff, and it's easy to connect to them, I think.
And did the internet have a huge role in you being able to make this film? I mean, are you almost just Googling, like, you know, female directors from this country, and you can come up with information in the way that you never could?
Yeah, simple as that. You know, I didn't have to go to any archives for this at all. You know, it was, especially when you're working on zero budget, you can't afford to jump on a flight to the Moscow Film Archive or something. It was simple desk research, internet research, exactly as you described. I typed in great female filmmakers from, copied that title, and then copied that line, and then put in different country after country after country after country. And all these names popped up. Gilda de ABREU, for example, a great Brazilian filmmaker. I'd never seen her work. And within 20 minutes, I was watching a clip of her work. I went to Madrid recently, and to the gorgeous new Cinematheque in Madrid, and started talking about Ana Mariscal, great movie star from the 1950s from Spain. And I asked how many people in the audience had seen any of the films that she directed. And this is a cinephile audience. No one. And so I said, I'm going to go to her grave tomorrow and bring some flowers. And anybody want to join me? And one person showed up. And we went, and her grave was almost impossible to find, no marking. So, you know, there's a kind of sadness about this, a kind of fury. We can feel angry about this, obviously. Yeah. But in Women Make Film, I thought the tone should be affirmative. It should be looking at the work and saying, how did the visual imagination of this great artist work, you know? And other people can debate with their own film culture. Why did we leave it so long to recognize her?
One of the pleasures of watching it is the kind of joy that you get from watching all these films, and many of them people won't know at all. And there are obviously the little touchstones like your Wayne's World, your Point Break, where even somebody who doesn't know much about film history will be able to find their way in, which is so great. But for you, who was the biggest discovery while making this?
You know, there were so many. The Ana Mariscal, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, I didn't know there was any female Spanish filmmaker of the 1950s. Loads and loads in Czech Republic and many places. But I think for me, it was probably Sumitra Perez, great filmmaker from Sri Lanka who's still alive, and I'm lucky enough to be in contact with her, which is wonderful. She's in her 80s now, and she was making poetic films with a touch of Nick Rogue in terms of the zoomy lensiness of it. And her very first film as a director was called The Girls, and it's utterly beautiful, and it's on the internet. And it's desperately in need of restoration. And so to discover her, you know, as a sort of working class Buddhist Sri Lankan filmmaker, you know, who went to France, became, I think, the French ambassador from Senegal or from Sri Lanka or something like that. Speaks beautiful French, very francophile. And here was a world of Buddhism, working classness, feminism, you know, teenage girls and francophilia all mixed up in this rich sort of stew of cinema. And that was a huge discovery for me.
Mm-hmm. And her film appears in The Girls, that appears in a number of different chapters in your film. So there are 40 chapters overall. How did you decide, say, with her, like, you know, which chapters she should be in? Because that must be, I mean, so just to state, there are 182 filmmakers who are included in this film, and there are over 1,000, I think, film clips. So, I mean, sort of just trying to marshal everything, and it must have been quite a feet.
Let me show you something. This was what we had in the edit suite, a piece of paper that was the list of films. See how long it is? It goes on and on and on and on. It's like something like 20 meters. That was that was the piece of paper that I used to try and help me understand where I was in the story. And you mentioned 40 chapters. I just scribbled the themes down in this piece of paper. Themes like staging and discovery and economy and melodrama and time passing and politics and home and horror, etc. And so I've always used bits of paper, you know, I draw a lot, and I've always used bits of paper to help marshal a big project. And this was a big project. In terms of the chapters, I knew I didn't want to tell a story, a chronological story, Isabel. I didn't want to talk about the lives of these artists. I didn't want to talk about them as victims of a sexist film industry. I wanted to focus solely on what they did behind the camera, and that helped. So then it became about craft questions. How do you frame a shot? How do you do all the different things that filmmakers do? So that sort of, the structure of the film came out of that. The focus on the filmmakers came out of that. The lack of interviews came out of that.
Mm-hmm. And why did you decide not to do the chronological approach?
If you start with chronology, there were very few female filmmakers in, for example, the 1910s, and so if you go 1910s, 1920s, etc., it takes a long time before you get to it, the flood. It's a trickle for a long time, and I just don't like that shape, trickle, widening flood. You know, it takes you until the 1950s, and I think the influence of Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, which came out at the end of the 1940s, before the number of female filmmakers really expands. And so that would be the wrong story to tell. Also, if you do it chronological, you can't show, for example, that Kathryn Bigelow films a chase sequence the way GUY-BLACHÉ does many decades earlier. And I wanted to jump around in time to show that some of the basic questions of filmmaking, like how do you shoot a car chase or a chase sequence, or how do you film a body, or how do you film dance, these are sort of timeless questions. They're ahistorical questions. They're not really chronological questions. And so I had complete freedom to jump around and intercut scenes from very different periods.
As you say, I mean, the kind of collisions between different filmmakers is definitely one of the pleasures of watching this film. And one that I particularly liked was in the dream sequence, where I think there was a Wendy Toy film, and you show a sequence from one of her films where these doors in these paintings suddenly open and the characters walk through the door. And then you jump to Aparna Sen's film, and you have a similar door opening, and there's just this amazing kind of illusion beyond the door. do you have a favourite juxtaposition in the film where you have sort of two filmmakers who people would never have thought of being together suddenly collide?
I loved the final chapter is about, as you know, it's about singing and dancing. And there's a lovely bit from an early Alice Guy-BLACHÉ film where a silent film obviously, where a family hears music and it can't help itself and it starts to get up and dance. And in the same sequence, we don't go directly from that to Beyoncé's Lemonade, but to have a sequence in which you've got Alice Guy-BLACHÉ, really sort of primitive shot of people can't resist the music, to Beyonce and the similar impulse. I loved that. But the connections, making the connections, I always say that things like that, it's like having two voltages, a voltage between two poles and a battery, and you're looking for a spark to jump between the poles. And in editing, sometimes the spark jumps.
Was there a scene right from the beginning that you knew would be in this film, like right from the start when you first had the idea from it?
I think that, you know, if there was one totemic film that really was the kind of seed or the kernel, it was The Asthenic Syndrome, directed by Kira Muratova. That film's so important for me because it was the only film banned during the on-banning time in the Soviet Union. So when Gorbachev was opening everything up, this film was so daring, so shocking, so bleak, and so critical of society that it was suppressed. I just really love the film, and I knew there's a scene of the main character on a bus, and she's grieving and she's angry with society. The whole of society's sick, and the camera's locked off, and the bus turns, and as it does, the light goes travels across the bus, and it's just a lovely scene, and it really captures something about her mentality and her worldview, and so I knew that scene had to be there.
And did you always envisage it being focused on directors? Because I guess one of the things that maybe people have said about film history and the auteur theory in particular, which says that sort of directors have the supreme artistic vision, that many women have been excluded from sort of an appreciation in film history because they weren't directors, because they were editors, because they were not cinematographers, but script writers perhaps. So how did you was this something you were thinking about? Did you kind of ever why directors?
Because I'm a director and I understand that best. I'm not an actor, so I don't understand how acting works, and so I could not make a film about acting, and I've never done so. I'm not an editor, so I don't think you need to stick to what you know a bit, and also realize what you don't know. And so I don't know a lot about those other things, even though I try to inform myself. In terms of the auteur thing, I've heard people talk about auteur as if it's about men. Who's the greatest auteur in cinema? Probably Agnes Varda. If you want to look at the uniqueness and consistency of styles, most of the women in Women Make Film are auteurs, and so I was very happy to focus on the director. The director may not be the controlling genius of the whole thing, but the director she's the central figure. The director is the person who pulls everything together, and therefore it's the best way. It's still for me the best way into a film and a career.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you also do concentrate on chapters. You have chapters like about editing, and obviously there's lots about cinematography, tracking shots, things like that, where you do mention the you have a sense of the kind of collaborations as well that people have worked on, which I thought was interesting. If obviously you said you're in touch with Sumitra Perez now, how does she feel about being included in this film?
I haven't spoken to her on the phone. I've got her phone number, but to be honest, I'm too shy to phone her. I hate phones, and I'm quite a shy person in a way, so I don't. She's a hero of mine, and so I haven't called her. I mean, I think I got a message saying that she was honoured to be approached by somebody from UK. She said the last time she'd been approached by anybody from the UK to talk about her work seriously was Lindsay Anderson and the critic David Robinson way back. I know some of her work is shown at the London Film Festival, and that's great, but to get to your 80s and to be a Europhile and to realise that somebody's trying to tell a story of film history in Europe, and you're right at the centre of it, must be satisfying. and we're hoping, I think it must be great, to do that. And let's remember, a lot of these filmmakers are still alive, and not getting the recognition. Marion HÄNSEL, for example, who's just one of the great filmmakers, I think. She started making films in the early 80s, and she's still making films. Just made a new film, and she was an acrobat, and she was in some Agnes Varda films, and then she had a terrible heart disease and has made a film about that, and she's made an essay film about clouds. What a filmmaker,
I mean, watching the final chapter in the film where you talk about dance scenes, and there was a great scene of hers that just made me immediately go out and want to watch that film. I think it was Lily, and it's just this woman in this purple dress, and I think the camera's above, and it's just so visually brilliant. It was really eye-opening for me.
If you look up that film on, I don't know, IMDb or something, it gets a really low score, like 4 out of 10 or 5 out of 10, and yet it's her tracking shots, her use of camera, her camera positioning in particular, with her cinematographer. And as you say, that dance scene is really beautiful. We go above the head of the actor, the dancer, and there's slow motion, and she understands exactly the best place to look at the action from. And you could just define that as directing. I think she's really great, Marion HÄNSEL.
And you came to prominence presenting a TV series called Scene by Scene, where you would interview filmmakers about their careers. If you could pick one of the filmmakers from Women Make Film who's no longer with us to interview, who would you pick?
I would pick Olga Preobrazhenskaya, because she was one of the first ever female filmmakers, and she made wonderful movies in the silent period, and she was a dancer, as I recall. Lots of the great female directors were dancers or choreographers, and she was way back in the roots of cinema, way back at the back of the cave of cinema, and I want to know what it was like back in that cave. Can you hear an ambulance here?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I've got a hospital right down there, so I get ambulances ready. So yeah, regularly. Yeah, Olga Preobrazhenskaya.
And your film is narrated by a number of women filmmakers, one of which is Jane Fonda. How did you convince Jane to be involved in this?
It was really hard. Everybody wants Jane Fonda to work with Jane Fonda. I went through the great British film producer, Jeremy Thomas, making a film about him. He put me in contact with a great producer and friend of hers in America, who was an agent of many of the movie stars like Elizabeth Taylor. And it's like a series of tests or thresholds. You pass this test and you get closer and closer to the actual Jane Fonda. And this guy, Michael Gruskoff, he phoned me, and I was in a restaurant. My phone went, and I went out, and he said, "Okay, convince me." And I was, here's why I should get a chance to email Jane Fonda. And he said, "Okay, write me an email." And I wrote him an email, and he emailed back, and he said, "One of the best emails I've ever received. It's going to Fonda now." And within a couple of hours, I think, she was saying yes. And so I went to her house, and we had guacamole. And I mean, she's, people. I was lucky enough to know Donald Sutherland way back in a bit, and he said, you fall in love with Jane Fonda. And people said, when you meet Jane Fonda, you fall in love with Jane Fonda, and it's absolutely true. She's got this. I was working with a Ukrainian sound recorder, and she was talking about Ukraine, and as soon as she mentioned Ukraine, Fonda clicked into talking about Ukrainian politics, very knowledgeable. And, she could tell from my accent, I'm from Northern Ireland, very knowledgeable about Northern Ireland. So there's all that knowledge, all that plugged into the world. And then a gentleness, she wears her knowledge lightly, a kindness. She said to me, "Are you hungry?" And I'm always hungry. So I said, "Yes." And she said, afterwards, "What are you going to do now?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go to the bar around the corner to have a martini to celebrate having worked with Jane Fonda." I said to Jane Fonda, and do you know what Jane Fonda said back? "Can I come?"
How did you approach the narration? Obviously, did you envisage having these filmmakers on board from the start? And how did you apportion each section to each, the chapters to each of them?
So what you do in the edit suite here is I would write it and then record my voice as a guide and cut it all. So, you know, when you're working on low budget, you have to, there's no room for chopping and changing. So the whole thing was edited and picture locked, as we say. And then as I started approaching the voiceover artists, Kerry Fox, Sharmila Tagore, Adjoa Andoh, Thandie Newton, Debra Winger, Tilda Swinton, who's also exec producer, I started to think, you know, first of all, I just wanted to work with really credible people who were great artists and actors, and also had a sense of men and women which wasn't stereotyped. And then I looked at the chapters and thought, you know, who would be really great to do this bit? And I thought I'd love to hear Jane Fonda narrating the chapter on work, for example, you know, because she's been active in multiple labour movements. And Kerry Fox, because of her daring choices about body and sexuality, I thought she would be great doing the sex chapter, for example. And so try to apportion chapters to the voiceover artists who would be most interested, and gave them choice as well. I said, you know, I'm thinking of this. Does this take your fancy? You know, and Sharmila Tagore was we recorded her in India, and she was initially concerned about doing the comedy chapter. And I said, okay, if you don't want to do it, don't want to do it. And then she did it, and she did it very well, I think.
And as I understand it, was it you and Tilda had a conversation about the title of the film as well, and it was her suggestion that it was Women Make Film?
Yes, well, the initial title was Eye Opener, and we weren't going to put women in the title at all, and then we just thought that would be perverse. So I had called it Women Making Film, a new road movie through cinema, and Tilda said, why don't you just do Women Make Film, which is punchier, shorter. Also, it's an exhortation. It's something, it's looking to the future. It's saying women make film, you know. So I thought it was a much better title. Mm-hmm. Tilda's great on titles. I was emailing her about something yesterday and suggested a title, and she came back with something, and it was much better.
Oh. Well, there are lots of conversations that you had with people about this project, you know, that because I understand you had like sort of researchers, almost like a festival where you have people sort of watching films beforehand. Like, how sort of big was your kind of net, and did you have like advisors from different parts of the world that you were turning to as well?
I had two people who watched films for me. Sonali Batarichia in London, and she watched South Asian films and some Hungarian films. And Timo Langer, the editor of the film, and he watched lots of German language stuff and American stuff, etc. Beyond that, what I did was, I mean, I had seen a lot of the stuff anyway, you know, but beyond that, I just asked friends in different countries. I'm lucky enough to know real movie lovers, cinephiles in many countries. So the very first idea for the film came with a conversation with Anita Oxberg, who's a great producer in Sweden. And out of that came the idea of the film, and she was able to advise me about Swedish cinema. But again and again, in Albania, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in many countries, I knew somebody who could give me the sort of grassroots knowledge, which, you know, is valuable. You know, I could say just who really was doing the innovative work.
You mentioned Bulgaria. I mean, one of the sort of discoveries for me of the film is BINKA ZHELYAZKOVA, who made a really incredible film noir that you show in your film. And again, also Edith CARLMAR, who made Death is a Caress around the same time. And that for me was fascinating, because, I mean, noir is seen as such a sort of male-dominated terrain, and here were two women who were making it, but not in America. So, you know, again, is maybe the fact that they were making these films outside of, you know, not in the English language, is that sort of contributed to the fact that we don't know about them today?
It has partly, you know, it really, like you, I get so angry every year when it comes around to talking about film noir, you know, and Noirvember, as they call it, when you talk about film noir. Every year I get annoyed when people talk about all these male auteurs and don't mention some of the people you mentioned, BINKA ZHELYAZKOVA, Edith CARLMAR. But also remember, in the English language, we had Ida Lapido, we had Muriel Box, who made several noirs, we had Wendy Toy in our own country, in the UK. And so we can't blame the language barrier necessarily, you know. We have to blame categories in our head, assumptions about what noir is. you know, that it's a male protagonist and a femme fatale. If you look at all the thinking around noir, it's really quite gendered. And even if people write about the, you know, that great book Women in Film Noir example, it's still, we have to always ask, but where are the women directors in this conversation? And loads of women made great noirs. And Death is a Caress that you mentioned is 1949, as I remember. That's quite early in the noir cycle. And yeah, it's, once again, take any genre and you could apply the same, you could ask the same questions. Are we really sure that women didn't make the best in this genre? And the answer often is no, we're not sure.
One thing that you draw attention to at the end of the film isn't sort of stated up front all the time is the fact that we're also watching a lot of films that feature way more women protagonists, and you know, women's lives are much more to the fore in all of these films. And to me, you know, that is obviously quite a, you know, a radical thing that suddenly you realise, yeah, this is an opening up as well of stories and the kind of stories that we tell. Was that something that you'd sort of thought about, you know, you knew was going to be part of this anyway?
I wanted to take a real evidence-based approach, Isabel. You know, the number of people who said to me, women make films about children or about relationships, or because women are more empathic, then they're making more empathic stories, you know, and that's us projecting onto the history of women in film our values, you know, the mostly liberal values that I just described, and other people project onto women other sort of more right-wing values like homemaker or prostitute or things like this, you know. I didn't want to do that projection. I wanted to look at the evidence. What have women actually made? And if you look around the world, the only thing I could really generalize about is the point you just mentioned, that there are far more female protagonists in films directed by women. And I think that's great. And I love the way in the film Kerry Fox says that. She says that line and she nearly blasted the microphone away. She said it so loud, you know. Beyond that, most of the generalizations, like women don't make war movies, or women don't make history films, or women don't make epic films, these things aren't true. So it was great to discover all these female protagonists, but I didn't go into the process looking for that in particular. That was a result of the sort of detective work, you could say.
And you end with an image of Beyonce and the baseball bats, you know, smashing the camera from her film Lemonade. How much is this film a sort of challenge to the canon? You know, do you think that we need to, you know, smash the canon up? Is it a problem? You know, how film is taught in universities, does this all need to be revised in your view?
100%. We should do to the canon what Beyonce did to that car with the baseball bat. We need to smash it. Canons always need to be smashed. They're useful Trojan horses to, you know, get inside the citadel and to storm the citadel. Absolutely. The second part of your question about universities and film courses, you know, the number of people who have come up to me after seeing this and said, I spent a lot on my film degree and I wasn't taught any of this. You know, a lot of film students, I think, will rightly ask, where are these women in the course that I'm being taught? And to be fair to the people teaching film history or the practice of film around the world, they weren't taught this stuff either. You know, so we're not blaming them for excluding these women, but we have to say, come on, look at this plenitude. We have to change every single film course that doesn't teach large numbers of women. And it's already happening, thankfully, you know. And I was lucky enough with that story of film that I made, you know, it changed a lot of film courses around the world, but we're aiming to do even more now. You know, people really need to teach BINKA ZHELYAZKOVA. People really need to teach EDITH CARLMAR. People really need to teach Drahomira Vihanova, as well as, you know, the other Czech filmmakers. People really need to teach SUMITRA PERIES. People really need to, you know, look at this. So we've got, everybody knows who Agnes is, right? But that took a while. That took decades, you know. But Sarah Maldoror died recently, you know, and a lot of people haven't seen her film Sambisanga, despite the fact that it's been on YouTube for years. And it's one of the great films. Now, there's BINKA. And there's Yulia Saltsneva. You know, we have to see these people's work. They have to be taught. They have to have box sets. Their films have to be restored, and they have to be written about.
Do you think that not enough of these films are restored? Like, what is the sort of situation of them? Like, you know, are they in archives? Yeah.
I mean, luckily there are really good people in archives protecting some of this work. I'll show you something briefly. See what that says? BINKA. I'll show it to that camera as well. BINKA. So these are Blu-rays or DVDs of her films that were struck for me by the Bulgarian Film Archive, because to trust me, you know, I'm not going to spread these about commercially, but they knew I could try and get the word out about BINKA, and I'm sure people have been following me are sick of hearing me talking about this person, you know, but her work needs a box set. And absolutely, and everybody, that's where I get really angry. I'm mostly an optimistic person, but that's where I get really angry. You know, we need to restore the work and make it available and widely available. And every time we make a list of the best Polish films of all time, if Wanda Jakubowska is not on there, if the great female filmmakers are not on there, then the list is invalid.
Talking of lists, obviously you have been a regular contributor to Sight and Sound film magazine where I work, and you know we put together this greatest films list that's been going since the 1950s. How different do you think that list will look in 2 years' time when we do it again?
In 2 years' time, probably not different enough. It's going to take a while, you know, for things to filter through. Some filmmakers are, you know, rose quite quickly in your list, like Apichatpong, for example, you know, but it's going to take a long time for the information about the past of the great female directors to filter through properly. And I'm not saying just because of women make film, about the work that lots of people are doing around the world to create the change that we need in film history. So, you know, I think we're looking. How often do you do it? Every 10 years?
Every 10 years. So
let's look that in 12 years' time, that Sight and Sound has loads of these female filmmakers in the top 50.
Okay, well, I'm hopeful in 2 years' time we'll get there. There'll be lots more there too. But yeah, I guess we'll see.
Astrid Henning-Jensen, we haven't mentioned her. You know, in Norway you've got Edith KARLMAR and Astrid Henning-Jensen. And I mean, did she win an Oscar? I think she did. Completely unreferred to by general cinephiles. She needs to be really high up in the Sight and Sound poll in 12 years' time.
Well, it definitely struck me when I was watching your film, because you don't mention very much of you know, the filmmakers' biographies, but you do mention where the film like won a prize in Cannes, and that was you know, quite eye-opening that a lot of these films were kind of heralded to some extent at their time, but then they have slipped away. And maybe it was because the filmmakers didn't, you know, I mean, KARLMAR is an interesting case because she actually made 10 films, but I'm guessing that quite a few of the filmmakers maybe only made a handful of films. And so perhaps that doesn't allow them to be canonized in the same way that, you know, your Fellinis and your Scorseses do, because they have such a body of work that people can refer to.
Could be, but think of somebody like Wendy Toy, who was working for 70 years. And she's not remembered. And you could argue that the opposite way around, Isabel. You know, sometimes people who just make a few films, they become ultra rarefied and special and admired for that reason, you know, and they haven't worked long enough to make terrible films yet, you know. So you could argue that either way. One thing I would say is that a lot of these filmmakers did not have big marketing budgets behind them, and therefore the films weren't pushed out into the world enough. And I think that's a problem, you know. And if you didn't, but the reason normally I don't mention Oscars or stuff in anything that I do, but I mention, as you say, prizes and things just to make people aware that these weren't marginal pieces of work that were only seen by a sort of intellectual cognoscenti. You know, these films won world prizes in cinema.
And I guess another thing that I thought about when I was watching it is a lot of the filmmakers were actors first, and that seemed to be a path that women obviously, maybe found it slightly easier to break into the industry that way.
Yes, I think that's true. You got power some way, became famous by being an actor. A lot of the women in the Western world were privately wealthy. In the former Soviet bloc, you get a lot of working class women getting a chance to make cinema. But in other countries, it tended to be wealthier women. Often their husband was doing something in the industry as well, and so that was another way in. So you got in by whatever way necessary. If you've got the desire for cinema, the longing to make cinema, the need to make cinema, then it'll be whatever means necessary. A lot of dancers, as I say, as well.
Well, I think we're coming up to the end. So I just want to say thank you very much to Mark. That was really enlightening. And thank you to everyone at home who's been watching too. Part 1 of Women Make Film is currently available to watch on BFI Player, and future parts are being added each week. Mark has curated a collection of films for BFI Player, films that are featured in the documentary. So please explore those on BFI Player too. And if you have enjoyed this event, please consider donating to the BFI. We are a charity and our venues are closed at the moment during this lockdown. So your support will be greatly appreciated to help us continue our work through this period of closure. And yeah, thank you to everybody and good night.